General William Bradford stood on the hill overlooking the dense Philippine jungle, his polished boots reflecting the harsh tropical sun. He had arrived from Washington just 3 weeks ago with orders to crush the Filipino resistance fighters who dared to challenge American control. With his perfectly trimmed mustache and chest full of medals from campaigns in Cuba and Mexico, Bradford believed he had seen everything war could offer. He gathered his officers around a large map spread across a wooden table and spoke with absolute confidence. "These Filipino rebels are nothing but farmers with old rifles," he declared, his voice dripping with contempt. "They hide in the jungle like scared rabbits because they know they cannot face real soldiers in open battle. We will sweep through these mountains in 2 weeks, maybe less. I've fought Apache warriors, Spanish regulars, and Mexican revolutionaries. These jungle peasants will break the moment they hear our artillery." His officers nodded in agreement, though some of the younger lieutenants who had already spent months in the Philippines exchanged worried glances. The general's campaign began with brutal efficiency as American columns marched into the mountain villages, burning homes suspected of sheltering rebels and arresting anyone who looked suspicious. Bradford ordered his men to cut down the jungle itself, creating wide paths where his superior numbers and modern weapons would give him every advantage. He sent messages to the rebel leaders demanding immediate surrender, promising harsh punishment for continued resistance. But deep in the mountains, these threats only strengthened the Filipino fighters' resolve. Among them was a quiet man named Diego Manalo, a farmer's son who had grown up hunting wild boar and deer in these very forests. Diego was 24 years old, thin and weathered from years of hard work under the sun, with hands that were steady as stone and eyes that could spot a mouse moving in tall grass from 100 yards away. While General Bradford boasted in his comfortable command post about the coming victory, Diego cleaned his old Spanish Mauser rifle, a weapon he had taken from a dead soldier during an earlier battle. He had heard about the American general's arrogance through the network of villagers who secretly supported the resistance, and something cold settled in his heart. He knew that arrogance in war was a weakness, and weaknesses could be exploited. Diego volunteered for the most dangerous mission his commander had ever planned, to strike at the heart of the American forces and prove that the Filipino fighters were not helpless farmers. His commander, Captain Reyes, was a former school teacher who had lost his entire family when American soldiers burned his village. Reyes studied Diego carefully before speaking. "The American general inspects his forward positions every 3 days," Reyes explained, pointing to a crude map drawn on banana leaves. "He always comes at noon, always stands in the same spot on the ridge to look through his telescope at our territory. He thinks he is untouchable because his guards surround him. But there is one angle, one position where a skilled shooter could have a clear line of sight." Diego listened carefully, memorizing every detail of the terrain, the distance, the timing. The shot would be nearly impossible, over 800 yards across a valley, with wind swirling through the mountain pass, and only a few seconds when the general would be exposed between his guards. 3 days later, Diego moved into position long afore dawn, crawling on his belly through wet grass and thick mud to reach a rocky outcrop hidden by dense foliage. He carried only his rifle, 20 rounds of ammunition, a canteen of water, and a small pouch of dried fish. The sun rose slowly, burning away the morning mist, and Diego remained absolutely motionless, barely breathing, as American patrols passed below his hiding spot. Hours crawled by under the scorching sun, and insects bit his neck and arms, but Diego never moved, never scratched, never gave away his position.
At exactly noon, he heard the distant sounds of horses and men approaching the opposite ridge. Through gaps in the leaves, he watched General Bradford arrive with his entourage, officers in clean uniforms laughing at something the general said. Bradford dismounted and walked confidently to the edge of the ridge, pulling out his brass telescope to scan the jungle where he believed his enemies hid like frightened animals. Diego slowly, silently brought his rifle to his shoulder, his heartbeat steady and slow. He calculated the distance, felt the wind on his cheek, adjusted his aim slightly to the left to account for the breeze. The general stood there, perfectly framed between two of his guards, completely unaware that death was watching him from across the valley. Diego exhaled half a breath and gently squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shot echoed across the valley like thunder, and for a moment everything seemed frozen in time. General Bradford's telescope flew from his hands as the bullet struck him in the chest, spinning him backward into the arms of his shocked officers. Chaos erupted on the American ridge as soldiers dove for cover, officers shouted contradicting orders, and someone screamed for the medical corps. Diego didn't wait to see the results. He was already moving, sliding backward down the rocks, using every trick his father had taught him about disappearing into the jungle. Behind him, he could hear the Americans beginning to panic, their rifles firing blindly into the forest, their artillery starting to boom as they shelled empty hillsides. The shot had come from such a distance and from such an unexpected angle that the American soldiers had no idea where the sniper had fired from. They searched frantically, sending patrols in every direction, but Diego was already a mile away, moving like a ghost through terrain he had known since childhood. The news of General Bradford's death spread through both armies like wildfire, though the stories changed with each telling. The Americans were furious and terrified. Their supposedly invincible general had been killed by a single shot from an enemy they had dismissed as primitive and incompetent. They launched a massive manhunt, burning villages and interrogating hundreds of civilians, desperate to find the sniper who had humiliated them. But the Filipino fighters were inspired like never before, with volunteers flooding into their camps and supplies mysteriously appearing from villagers who had previously been too afraid to help. Diego became a legend overnight, though few people knew his real name or what he looked like. The Americans called him El Fantasma, the ghost, and soldiers grew nervous whenever they had to patrol the mountain trails, knowing that death might be watching them from any shadow. Captain Reyes knew they had achieved something far more valuable than killing one general. They had shattered the myth of American invincibility and proven that courage and skill could overcome superior numbers and weapons. But Reyes also knew the Americans would never forgive this humiliation, and their revenge would be terrible.
The new American commander, Colonel James Morrison, was nothing like the arrogant Bradford. Morrison was a hard, practical man who had fought Indians on the frontier for 15 years and understood guerrilla warfare. His first order was to stop the random reprisals against civilians and instead focus all resources on finding and killing the sniper. He brought in trackers from Arizona, expert marksmen from the Army's best units, and established a network of informants by offering huge rewards for information about El Fantasma. Morrison studied the killing shot carefully, measuring the distance, analyzing the angle, and came to respect his enemy, even as he planned his destruction. This wasn't luck, he told his officers grimly. This was a master shooter who knows this terrain perfectly. We're not hunting a farmer. We're hunting a ghost who could be anywhere, watching us right now. He divided his forces into small, mobile units that moved on unpredictable schedules, never establishing patterns that a sniper could exploit. Diego felt the noose tightening around the resistance fighters as the Americans changed their tactics. The new colonel was smart, patient, and deadly serious about his mission.
Villages that had secretly supported the rebels were now too terrified to help, cut off by American patrols and constant surveillance. Food became scarce, ammunition even scarcer, and the jungle that had once protected them now felt like a prison. Diego continued to operate, taking careful shots at American patrols when opportunities arose, but each success brought more hunters to the mountains. He lost count of how many close calls he had, American patrols that passed within feet of his hiding spots, trackers who nearly found his campsites, informants who betrayed the general areas where he operated. Sleep became a luxury he could barely afford, always moving before dawn, never staying in the same location twice. His hands began to shake from exhaustion and hunger, and he knew that eventually his luck would run out. But Captain Reyes needed him to accomplish one more mission, one final shot that could change everything. The Americans were bringing in a supply convoy with weapons, ammunition, and gold to pay their informants. If Diego could destroy that convoy, it might buy the resistance enough time to regroup and survive. Diego lay in the mud on a hillside overlooking the narrow mountain road where the American convoy would pass. His entire body ached from weeks of running and hiding, and he had not eaten anything but roots and insects for 3 days. Through his rifle scope, he watched the convoy approach, 20 wagons heavy with supplies, surrounded by over 100 American soldiers who were alert and ready for an ambush. But Diego's target wasn't the wagons. Intelligence from the resistance had revealed that Colonel Morrison himself would be traveling with this convoy, believing that his presence and overwhelming force would deter any attack. It was a trap, and Diego knew it. Morrison had deliberately leaked the convoy route, hoping to draw out El Fantasma and kill him. Snipers were hidden in the rocks on both sides of the road, and cavalry units were positioned to sweep the hillsides the moment a shot was fired. The smart choice was to retreat, to survive and fight another day. But as Diego watched through his scope, he thought about his village burned to ashes, his sister who had starved when the Americans destroyed all the crops, his father executed for refusing to betray the resistance. He thought about Captain Reyes and all the fighters who depended on him to give them hope that they could win this war. He knew that if he took the shot and killed Colonel Morrison, the Americans might finally realize that the Filipino fighters would never surrender, that this war would cost them more blood and treasure than they were willing to pay. But he also knew that taking the shot would almost certainly mean his death. The American snipers would triangulate his position within seconds, and the cavalry would surround the hillside before he could escape. Diego's hands steadied as he made his decision. He had never expected to survive this war. From the moment he picked up a rifle to fight for his country's freedom, he had accepted that death would find him eventually. The only question that mattered was whether his death would mean something, whether it would help his people win their freedom. Through the scope, he watched Colonel Morrison climb down from his horse to consult a map with his officers, presenting a clear target for just a moment. Diego's finger tightened on the trigger, and the rifle roared one last time. Across the valley, Colonel Morrison stumbled backward with a bullet through his shoulder. Diego had aimed for the chest, but exhaustion and hunger had affected his shot just enough to move it 2 inches to the right. It wasn't a kill shot, but it was enough. The Americans erupted in chaos for the second time, but now their response was immediate and overwhelming. At least 6 American snipers opened fire on Diego's position simultaneously, their bullets tearing through the foliage around him. Diego rolled behind a large rock as machine gun fire began to chew apart the hillside, dirt and stone fragments exploding in deadly clouds. He could hear cavalry horses thundering up the slope from both directions, officers screaming orders to take the sniper alive. Diego had 3 rounds left in his rifle. He knew he would never make it down the hill alive, but he had accomplished his mission. He had proven that no American commander was safe, that the Filipino fighters could strike anywhere, anytime. What happened next became the subject of fierce debate for generations. Some American soldiers swore they cornered Diego on that hillside and that he fought like a demon until their bullets finally brought him down. Others claimed he vanished into the jungle once again, escaping through some secret path that only the locals knew. Filipino veterans of the resistance told their children and grandchildren that Diego survived that day and many others, fighting throughout the war until independence finally came to their country. The truth was lost in the fog of war and legend, but what mattered was what Diego represented to his people. In the villages and mountains of the Philippines, parents told their children stories of the brave sniper who proved that courage and skill could defeat any enemy, no matter how powerful. Diego's story spread beyond the Philippines, inspiring resistance fighters in other countries who faced seemingly invincible occupiers. The Americans eventually left the Philippines, worn down by years of guerrilla warfare that cost them more than they ever imagined. Colonel Morrison survived his wound, but never forgot the lesson that hillside taught him, that you should never underestimate an enemy fighting for their homeland, and that arrogance in war is a fatal disease. Whether Diego lived or died that day on the mountain became less important than what he achieved with his impossible shots. He had shown his people that they were not helpless, that their struggle mattered, and that freedom was worth any sacrifice. In the end, the legend of El Fantasma became immortal, a reminder that sometimes one person with courage and skill can change the course of history with a single shot.